Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the National Civic League's August webinar, Journalism's Role in Strengthening Local Democracy. My name is Rebecca Trout, and I am the director of the National Civic League's All-America City Award and DC office. The League is a 28-year-old nonprofit. We have been advancing civic engagement and trying to create more equitable and thriving communities. Through our research and publications, our All-America City Award and other recognition programs and direct community assistance work. The All-America City Award is our flagship program. It began in 1949 to really recognize and lift up communities who are excelling at community engagement and participatory problem solving. And so we use our annual award program to really recognize and give those communities a platform. And then we use this webinar series as well as our other publications to try to share some of those promising practices, as well as other tools, resources, and ideas that communities can use to strengthen their engagement work. Before we dive into today's topic, just a little bit of a shout out to our 2023 All-America City Award winners. We were joined by 20 finalists in Denver, Colorado earlier this summer. They presented the story of their youth civic engagement work to a jury of national experts. The conference also included peer networking, keynote speeches, as well as a lot of fun. And at the end of the weekend, our jury named these 10 communities that you're seeing on your screen here as this year's All-America City Award recipients. They're all doing some really creative and inspiring work to engage young people in civic life. I really encourage you to go check their work out on our website, both in their sort of written summaries and live presentation to the jury. So congratulations to those communities again. And moving forward in 2024, I'm really excited about this year's coming theme. We're focused on communities that are strengthening democracy through local action and innovation. We look at this really broadly, and so you can see some of our ideas and project ideas that might be included in a future application. So if any of those look like your community or your community is trying to tackle sort of the strengthening of local democracy or civic engagement, then really have you consider applying. The application will actually be released in our upcoming newsletter here in September. And then we will have an informational webinar to give you a little bit more information about how you might apply. So the reason we're here today, of course, is to kind of talk about journalism's role in all of this. And, part of how we strengthen democracy is by having a really strong and innovative media and journalism ecosystem. So we have 4 speakers joining us here today to talk about this very topic. We will be joined by Martin Reynolds from the Maynard Institute, Jennifer Brandell from Corkin, David Plazas from the Tennessean, and Melissa Davis from the Colorado Media Project. So I will let them dive in here shortly, but basically the plan is kind of to discuss some of the challenges facing journalism right now, and how that led to the creation of a book that features essays from innovators from across the country about what they're doing to change and to improve journalism and media across the country. And then we'll of course hear about some of those models directly. Before I hand it off to our first speaker, just a few housekeeping rules. You'll notice that you are all muted. I ask that you remain that way to be respectful of our speakers and to cut down on any background noise. We will be having a Q&A period at the end of the webinar, so you can put your questions in the chat, and I will make sure we get to those at the end, or you'll also have an opportunity to use the raise hand feature. We are recording, so don't look like you need to take notes furiously. The webinar as well as the slides will be emailed to you either later today or tomorrow using the email address that you registered under. And with that, I'm excited to hand it off to our first speaker, Martin Reynolds. Martin?
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca. Very glad to be here. I'll just jump in here and share screen. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. Martin Reynolds, Maynard Institute, very glad to be here. And I'll jump right into it because we got a lot to get to. So this book, and I'm here sort of stepping in service of one of the creators of this book, Paula Ellis. And so I'm hopefully we'll do her justice in articulating sort of the background for why this book and why now. And so Paula was, if she were here, she would say that we're in this really compelling period of transformation and what might even be considered a creative destruction when the existing business models and companies from the industrial age are shifting away from the information age. And during these times of what's really, one could argue, certainly a measure of chaos and uncertainty, these white spaces open up for innovation, learning, and for growth. And this is happening in journalism and across many institutions that we see, including those once considered bulwarks of democracy. And so in journalism, innovators across the country are really experimenting with new ideas that can start small, but like all challenges to the status quo, eventually will find their way into the mainstream of acceptance. And while the threatened industries and institutions spread doom and gloom as they try to defend and maintain their primacy, there's this wonderful ecosystem of innovation in journalism, which in many ways is fueled by optimism and it's fueled by creativity and it's expanding. And that's exciting and a hopeful note. With this book, what we really wanted to do was to let more folks know about these innovations and to meet the innovators who are working on ways to really repair the fabric by realigning journalism with the public interest and fostering a far more inclusive and more reflective democracy. And, in these very perilous times, their work could not be more urgent, and they absolutely give us hope. So to talk a little bit about what some of the challenges that are facing American journalism are. Now, this list, I wouldn't say is in the list of order, in order of importance, because they're all incredibly important. But this issue around mis and disinformation, incredibly swift, inaccurate information spreading around, that's incredibly perilous for collective understanding, this economic sustainability. As mentioned, the old business models are simply not working, particularly in the paid ad space. That business model has utterly collapsed. Classified advertising and other advertising used to be the main source of revenue, particularly for newspapers. And that business has largely collapsed due to Google and Facebook and other online platforms. The other factor that's really a big issue that our news organizations and the journalism ecosystem writ large is navigating is this conversation about equity, inclusion. And I'll talk a little bit about belonging in the essay, in the piece about that I wrote, which is sort of the innovation that I would assert is necessary. But the lack of representation in organizations, and then this sort of history of toxic work environments in many journalistic institutions. The other part that we're navigating is this trust and credibility piece, which is actually part of a larger drop across all major institutions since in the last 50 years, there has been a collective decline in trust of major institutions, and journalism is no less a victim of that drop. Then there's also the polarization and the echo chambers. As the democratization of the web and the different kinds of channels and ability for people to create their own narratives, which is on the one hand been incredibly empowering for folks and interesting and dynamic. Not that there has ever been a shared narrative, but I can tell you now, there's even less of a shared narrative than there ever was, in large part because of the polarization and these echo chambers that emerge. And therefore, people are getting information. Not everyone is not getting the same information. You can just look at sort of how people are perceiving various issues that are happening now, and the information streams that are coming to them are different. And the narratives and conversations that are happening are different. Also, of course, technology and ethics, striking this balance between the need to embrace technology, but also the responsibility in reporting that it's a challenge. When you just think of, for instance, AI and how swiftly it is coming into collective use in our society, and how are we navigating this? These tools, this technology is moving faster than we as human beings have the capacity to navigate it, and understand its impact. Just think about if you saw the movie Social Dilemma and the impact that we've seen on social media on our young people. It's sort of often in the technology world, it's build it first and figure out what happens later. That's problematic. Sustainability of local journalism. Many outlets have faced closures, cutbacks due to financial constraints, but the flip side of that is that there's also a very powerful nonprofit journalism ecosystem that is growing and that's emerging, but the sustainability piece is a huge factor. Of course, we've got legal and press freedom, this rise of authoritarian sentiment that we're seeing around this. We've seen an increasing hostility towards the press, which is concerning, considering just look at what happened in Kansas the other day with a raid on a local news organization for doing its job. And of course, changing consumption patterns, how people are taking in news and information is shifting. It shifts across race and class and gender and generation. Again, these are challenges, but they're also incredibly exciting opportunities to meet people where they are. The question is journalism up to the challenge? And certainly last but not least, covering just these massive issues like climate change and global pandemics and conflicts take a lot of resources. And at a time when news organizations in some ways are in a state of contraction or protection, how do you cover massive issues in a way that's collective and that speaks to the needs of our society? All right. Now, pictured here are some, and on joining today, Jennifer and David, and they'll talk about their pieces, are some of the innovators, amazing authors who can write candidly at times, even emotionally, about their own experiences and the triumphs and the disappointments that have brought them to this point. Now, I think it's important to note that journalists don't really like writing about ourselves, but we were pushed to do so by Paula and also Paloma Dallas from the Kettering Institute. And so the result, I would say, is a real treasure in illuminating the essays that badly address some of the journalism's and democracy's greatest challenges, and even our own challenges being in this profession. And while it's relatively easy to glibly identify and diagnose problems, it takes guts to put yourself on the line and try and fix them. And so folks pictured here are among those who are doing that. They are serial entrepreneurs, they are intrapreneurs, and who inspire others away from demanding work days and to reflect on what we're learning and share it with others. And so that's exciting. And among the key themes here that came away from this, that democracy is imperiled and citizens must step up to really participate beyond just voting. Journalism must move beyond seeing its role as simply informing people and finding ways to be a tool for citizens to practice democracy every day. And democracy is a cultural and media both reflect the culture that shapes it. Information and technologies have ushered in this elemental changes in our society and communications that we are really only just beginning to understand, as I alluded to in the challenges. And relationships matter, and dialogue is a bridge to empathy and finding common ground. This notion of journalism, not merely as a tool, but actually needs to be done with care, which is, if you talk to some old school journalists, I don't know that they would actually agree with that to a great degree, right? Care, do no harm. There's something in the ethics that talks about do no harm. And there's a real struggle amongst journalists about, well, what does that actually mean? And what was and is now won't be the future. So, but pieces of future exist now. So these innovators are finding them. So that's where some of those key themes. And for my own piece that I wrote, I focused on this notion of belonging. And it was, and I'll just take just a few moments here before handing it off to Jennifer. And what I came away with it is in 2020, when George Floyd happened, and the calls for dismantling systemic racism and oppressive policing were happening in the streets. There was a simultaneous call that echoed across America's newsrooms. And it was reflective of that point that I made around the challenges related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, as we are seeing, increased tax on that since the SCOTUS decision. And as those calls were emerging, we at the Maynard Institute, which is the oldest journalism nonprofit dedicated to helping America's newsrooms reflect the diversity of the nation, also by training journalists of diverse backgrounds, we were asking what ought be the aspiration. And in talking with community organizers and talking with activists and folks in philanthropy, talking with folks from our community storytelling project that we've been running for 10 years, Oakland Voices, where we train residents to be storytellers, we settled on this notion of belonging. Because, and we didn't come up with this notion, folks like John Powell at the Belonging and Othering Institute at UC Berkeley and others have been doing this work. And if you look at sort of conversations around diversity work in other sectors, belonging has actually been there. But it had not been in sort of a mainstream American journalism. And so, because when you belong, you can feel it in your bones, you can feel it in the equitable pay you receive, you can feel it in not being the only one, you can feel it in the language you can use to tell a story, you can feel it in the sources that you can use to bring it forward. And most importantly, and as Michelle Garcia says, a journalist, you can feel it and see it in the journalistic gaze, G-A-Z-E, the kaleidoscope of gazes that you can bring forward to tell a story that will be reflective and feel authentic to the people that you are seeking to serve. And this notion of belonging, as we have these conversations, as we're navigating an increasingly polarized society, belonging is for all of us, or it ought to be. And so that also brings in people who may feel that this notion of belonging or thinking about equity and diversity in journalism isn't for them, isn't about them. Now, I would argue it's all of our work. We're all navigating these social constructs that shape perception. But from my perspective as a former newspaper editor and someone who's worked in community engagement and now co-leading the Maynard Institute, where we're training and trying to move journalism forward, this notion of belonging is an innovation that is not necessarily new, but if it could be embraced, it could be the start of bringing folks into the conversation, modeling the journalism around this notion of belonging, being in deeper relationship to community to help co-create. And then I'll end with this. The other part that occurred for me during this time was my own realization that I could no longer divest my perspective from the story that I was seeing on the streets as an African-American man in America, navigating the challenges that were brought forth during 2020 in this notion of objectivity. And I'll end here. A wise person once said that none of us are objective, but we can manage our subjectivity. And so as journalists, and what we are seeing as a shift in perspective, particularly around generation, younger journalists coming into news organizations now are not divesting their identities of race across race and class and gender and generation from the journalism they want to do. My generation was taught to be objective. And so there is this tension that exists. And it is my hope that belonging can be a mechanism through which these conversations can be had, journalistic models can be put forth, and products can be developed to serve community. And with that, I thank you. Handing it off to Jennifer, and I will stop the share.
Thank you so much, Martin. I appreciate both the spot on Paula impersonation. She would be proud. And thank you also for mentioning Paula. She helped us organize this, not only this webinar, but of course the book as well, and couldn't be with us here today because of some issues with the hurricane that she's facing. So Martin stepped in here to go over her slides and give us sort of set the stage for today's conversation. And then of course, appreciate you sharing your innovation about the importance of belonging. We here at the Lead talk a lot about belonging's importance and sort of community building and civic engagement. And it's nice to get that perspective of how it's affecting and can be used in journalism as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. I now want to introduce our next speaker, Jennifer Brandel from Hearken. Jennifer?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be joined by The fellow essayists in this book, as well as Melissa, who's doing great work in Colorado, you'll hear about shortly. And I wanted to start with this provocative title, American Democracy Doesn't Need Saving, It Needs Creating. Because in essence, I think to be better for democracy, newsrooms and journalists need to be better at democracy. And that means representation, participation, all of the things that we think about as hallmarks of American democracy. And so I wanted to take you through some of the projects, initiatives, and thinking, as well as insights from those, from some of the things that I've been involved with that relate to the work that you're all doing and that are part of the essay in the book. So I've been curious personally about journalism and democracy for many, many years. And I've had the great opportunity and honor to co-create or create all of the things that you see here that include webinars, guides, directed courses, workshops, etc., to help newsrooms start to wrestle with these big questions and make tactical and practical changes. What's really hard, and Martin alluded to this, is just some of the ways that journalism has always operate really incentivize taking shortcuts around some of the values that we get into the business with, and we end up kind of losing those because of business models, collapse of revenue, etc. And so I wanted to talk about two particular questions I've been exploring for the last 10 or more years, actually. One question is, could flipping the model of journalism on its head so that the public has a say in what reporting is created, expand the democratic imagination for what's possible, and improve outcomes for all? My working answer right now is yes, actually, and absolutely yes. And I'll tell you a little bit about that first experiment called Curious City. And then another question I've been thinking about is whether you, by centering elections coverage on what the electorate wants politicians to be talking about, rather than what politicians want the electorate to hear from them, could that increase trust in journalism and the efficacy of political reporting? And all signs for that also point to yes. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the citizens' agenda as well. So I want to take you back to a younger version of myself in 2011 when I was at WBEZ in Chicago, a public radio station. And I was there really not coming into journalism from J school. I studied lots of other things. I had an arts background. But when I was in the newsroom, I started to wonder, how might we represent a more diverse spectrum of people and experience in the editorial decision making? Because no matter how diverse our newsroom is, in some aspects and dimensions, we are really not able to represent a city as diverse as Chicago in the information that we're supposed to be getting them. So then I wondered if the public could be involved in the journalism without compromising journalistic integrity, all of the things that journalists will balk at when they say, bring the public inside. And then could we make journalism more human-centered, satisfying, and ultimately delightful? Because I find learning to be delightful. I find journalism to be theoretically about learning, but rarely is it delightful or satisfying to me. So I wanted to explore that as well, even with tough subjects. I'm not talking about doing cat videos here. And so I wanted to tell you about how we started to futz with the editorial process and the story cycle and the insights that we got from that. So traditionally, this is the way most newsrooms do their stories. And this is a generalization, but it's illustrative. So typically the newsroom is highly involved in the various decision points before they publish or broadcast. So pitching stories, assigning stories, reporting stories, and then the moment they publish or broadcast, most of the time journalists have to run on to their next story. They don't have the luxury to learn and listen and have dialogue with the people that they're trying to serve. And likewise, the public is in the dark pretty much until the story's already done and out the door. And maybe they can comment, maybe not, but they're really left with whatever the decisions the newsroom made. This really puts the newsroom and the public further away from each other than they could be and out of step and not co-evolving as they could be. And so what we've been experimenting through my company Harkin, which I grew out of this Curious City experiment, is about public powering the story cycle. How do you involve the public the whole way? How might you give them an opportunity to ask the questions that they're Googling for and asking around, but don't have fact-checked or verified good information for? And then can you as a newsroom curate the best questions that have come up and let the public ultimately decide on how to spend your budget and time, because you're trying to serve them after all. So shouldn't they have a say? And then my favorite part as a reporter was actually working with the people whose stories were assigned and having them participate, a ride along, going to an interview, understanding more about how journalism gets made. This is oftentimes called media literacy, but this is really fun embodied media literacy in which people get to be highly involved in the story. And then after something's published or broadcast, you can keep that cycle going, asking people what follow-up questions they have. What else do they want to know? Because so many of the systemic problems we're dealing with today are not a one-off story. They are a story over time. And to give people an opportunity to say, here's what more information we need to do our work as citizens and make change. Here's another just quick way of looking at it as well, is that traditional reporting typically starts with the newsroom in the position as a parent, saying, here's what we think you need to know. And the audience is really flattened into data or demographics or dollars. They're really abstracted on a level. And so this public powered approach, which starts with listening, changes that dynamic. And the newsroom really positions itself as a servant, as customer service, if you will, asking, what do you not know that we can find out for you and with you? And so that makes the people that they are serving much more whole, much more embodied, much more interesting and not extreme. It helps people become more multidimensional and also creates really great sources for stories that aren't just the people in power or people who have no power at all. So I'll just give you a quick example of how this can work in reality. Bay Curious is one of our partners out of public media in the Bay Area, KQED. We work with a lot of public media, but also we work with, print, digital, you name it, broadcasts. It works for whatever the format. So listener Eric has a question and he asks Bay Curious on their website. Reporter Olivia sees the question. She's like, this is a great idea. Then she curates it against other questions that are similar in tone or scope. She reports the story with Eric's involvement and then publishes it. And the story ends up performing way better than their typical stories, in part because they're answering something other people have thought about but isn't in the news. So it's creating these original stories that aren't just chasing a press release or trying to beat someone to be the fastest to publish something. It's really adding new ideas to the democratic dialogue when people get to ask things that aren't already answered. And so what we found is that the public's questions can do so many of the things that traditional newsrooms are wanting to do, like accountability reporting and break news. So for instance, in Chicago, where I live, a bunch of people noticed that the Park District's water fountains were on 24/7 and asked Curious City, our partner in Chicago, why? And because the reporters are there to be of service, they decided to start looking into it. And what they found was that the water was so contaminated with lead that the Park District was trying to flush it to get levels down to EPA quality, and they couldn't. This was not something that was in the news. This is something that then became a longstanding news item that even affected our mayoral elections and is affecting a lot of budget right now. And this all came from people just noticing water fountains on. Another example I love when this happens is when the public can correct the record. So one of our partners in The Hague in the Netherlands wanted to know, one of their audience members wanted to know why a street sign dedicated to Nobel laureate Madame Curie is misspelled as though she is a prostitute. Very unfortunate misspelling. She had gone through the normal routes that a citizen could take. She was petitioning, trying to call her city council. She stopped short of a protest, but that would have been a lot of energy. Instead, she asked the newsroom the question. They were able to report on it, and within 24 hours, that street sign was changed. So the citizen in the newsroom were able to collaborate to make change faster and more expeditiously than an individual could have done on their own. And that's actually the lady in the right in the top photo who asked the question, going along for the ride and getting that street sign. So what we found, and this is just a snapshot of Curious City too, is that this kind of audience-led or public-led reporting can also result in immense creativity unleashed and a lot of relationship and belonging, like Martin was talking about, of really allowing people to connect with one another, to stop seeing the media as the media, some abstraction, but as real people that they know and respect and understand how hard and rigorous their work is. And it can also result in all these community activities that bring people together. One of my favorite things in the lower center picture, you can see all these people lined up in front of the Bean, a very iconic Chicago landmark. And they're all teaching Chicagoans how to do different dance moves that were invented in Chicago, which came out of someone's question. I got a chance to go to this event, and I've never seen a cross section of Chicago all gathered in one place, joyously dancing, from the polka to different hip hop moves to dance moves that were invented in Mexico. It was unbelievable. And that all came through this creative approach to letting the public lead. The other thing I just want to say about questions and about basing journalism on the public's questions is that it can create an opening for dialogue in different futures. Because most of the time news is really based on the now, what just happened, asserting that, or a conjecture of what might happen very soon. But it doesn't usually allow for this bigger view about how did something get to be this way? What's the context for the news that we're seeing? Or how does something work? How do architects design new schools for security, knowing that school shootings are on the rise? And then what is possible? An example of our partners in Montreal, someone wanted to know, why don't churches open in the winter for people who are unhoused to keep warm if their goal is to really help their fellow man? And because they asked that question, churches started to open. They said, you're right. And so these sorts of stories can really create change much more quickly. It's also very good business. So a great study just came out. It'll be published. Well, it's already published, but it'll be more in the news later this week, that really proves engaged journalism can result in not only better relationships with the public, but also economic gains for newsrooms. And that's what we've seen as well. So I just want to take, 1 minute and tell you about applying this model to political reporting, which is the Citizens Agenda Guide. This is really a way of taking the same idea and taking it to elections coverage in particular. Because political and elections reporting is usually centered on politicians, not the electorate, it's where the newsroom, again, is at this privileged position and the public is just at the whim of whatever the newsroom reports, which is typically what politicians are saying. That's not how a democracy is supposed to work. The citizens, the public, are supposed to be in charge. And so this model allows reporters to ask the public what they want politicians to be talking about as they compete for votes. And then the newsroom to really be that conduit to the politician. And so we found great outcomes from here. A lot of the newsrooms we've taught about this process have eliminated their horse race coverage, which we know is really bad for democracy and many other things. They've created mission statements, they've done more solutions journalism, and they're co-creating content. I won't go through all of these, but I'll just say there's great case studies if you're interested in more citizens agenda approaches and how maybe libraries and newsrooms in the towns that you live in could collaborate to do these sorts of things. We're always game to brainstorm on that. We also just heard from the participants that their stories were more original, they had more community partnerships, they really felt like they were doing better work than they were beforehand with this model. We also have more research from UW-Madison that says it increased trust and many other great outcomes. The last thing I'll say about this, though, is that it's not perfect. We have a dynamic right now with politicians you're all very much aware of, in which the media has become an enemy for some of them. And so this is one way of trying to disarm politicians by asking them questions on behalf of the public and their constituents. They may not have as big of a leg to stand on when they're just attacking the newsroom and saying, how dare you ask me this question? And also with the public, if the public is attacking the newsroom saying, I can't believe you're covering this, this allows the newsroom to come back and say, what are you missing? What would you like to have answered? Again, trying to disarm people who are already convinced that the media is not on their side or corrupt in some way. So I just wanted to share out those ideas in general. We're really in service of building capacity and capability for democratic activities in newsrooms, and really trying to figure out how do we sustain a national pattern of democracy when it's not practiced at a more basic level. For us, we're just trying to help people practice it every day and create everyday opportunities for democracy. So thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it, and hope this was helpful. All right, back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Appreciate all of your mini experiments, all of which are laid out and with links and some additional great graphics in her essay, which is featured in a recent National Civic Review quarterly journal. Appreciate you also providing those really tangible examples of what public power journalism can and has been looking like. So thanks so much for doing that. Next up, we have David Plazas from the Tennessean. David? Floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it. I'm David Plazas. I'm the Opinion and Engagement Director for the USA Today Network Tennessee. It's fitting that we're doing it this week, a day after a special session occurred in Tennessee that turned into chaos, acrimony, and contentiousness, that I'm talking to you about a program called Civility Tennessee. And the term civility is an extremely controversial term. We are very well aware that some people have seen civility as a means to silence dissent. Others have seen it as a means to just say, stay polite, be a doormat, all those other things. But we decided 5 years ago as the Tennessean to empower ourselves with the original meaning of this term, that this was like the Latin term civitas, which is about the duty and power of the citizen to challenge society, to essentially uphold society and also be an active participant. And actually what we saw this past 10 days with the special session, which some would describe as in all sorts of really four-letter interesting words, is really what it is to be citizen participation oriented type of things that are really healthy for democracy, even if there is some yelling, even if there is some acrimony, because at the end of the day, citizens show that they could make a difference. So let me go to our next slide. I'm wondering, are you seeing this in whole the full slideshow? No, let me start from the beginning. This slideshow. There we go. Is that better? All right, perfect. No? Let me go back and share one more time. Sorry about that. Hang on one second. Okay. All right. Are you seeing the slideshow now? Yep. Okay.
We're seeing the slides, but it's not in slideshow view. So if you can just hit from the beginning there.
Yeah. Okay. Are you seeing it from the beginning then?
It looks like it's loading. I think it's, we can still see the slides. They're not in full slideshow view, but
okay.
I'd say move
Do you
forward.
see a slide that says, why can't we disagree in public right now?
No, we're on the Civility Tennessee slide.
Okay, let me share one. I'll just share it in non-slideshow view, and that may be better. Okay, so again, I mentioned this all because the work of the citizen essentially is to be active. And unfortunately, we have a very difficult situation right now in places like Tennessee and in the South, where there is very low voter turnout. Just a few years ago, Tennessee was 50th of states when it came to voter turnout. And this creates a real conundrum when it comes to when people say, why isn't our voice being heard? A lot of it is because of that. So you get things like gerrymandering, you get things like people being disconnected, politicians being disconnected from their communities. And you essentially get the situation where citizens themselves feel apathetic and don't participate. In the last couple of years, we've seen legislation that has been very detrimental to many groups, especially marginalized groups, being the erasure of certain lessons and curriculum, being on Black history, LGBTQ rights, looking at gender-affirming care in places like the South, and at the same time, the whole conversation around gun violence and what to do about it. This special session was called by the governor several months after a terrible shooting at a school called the Covenant School in Nashville, where 6 people were killed, including 3 9-year-old children. And even members of the governor's own party refused to want to participate. Some wanted to adjourn right away because they didn't see it as a good use of their time. The governor went forward, and even though not enough was done for those who were in the activists, they were there and they actually got a conversation started that was really important. So when Civility Tennessee started in 2017, our soft launch, we started asking, why isn't that people can, communicate with each other better? What if we could create role models? What if we ourselves as a news organization promoted, encouraged, and modeled civil discourse? And it required us to do some really important things, such as stop Twitter feuding, such as really going into our communities in a very visceral and intentional and authentic way, and not just the urban areas. Nashville is an urban community, but also the rural areas, the very red rural areas around Tennessee, from Pulaski, Tennessee, which was the start of the Ku Klux Klan, and now is trying to reshape its modern image, to Martin, Tennessee, Memphis, and Knoxville, all around. This is very important in a community and in a state like Tennessee, in which for a long time, and maybe even still today, a majority of citizens felt that the 2020 election was not fairly decided. And so we have an obligation as a news organization to go in and talk about the facts, but at the same time understand how to converse in a way that will bring people to the table. And so I've had many shares of meals of fried chicken and cherry pie with people where we get a chance to talk about everything from gun violence to the 2021 insurrection and so forth. So we had this mission from the editorial board for a long time. I'm a member of the editorial board along with some of our other editors. We talk about defending the First Amendment and freedom of information, amplifying the voices of underrepresented people, welcoming diverse viewpoints, and also standing for civility. But it didn't mean much for a long time. It was just there as this, it's a nice thing to have. The 2016 election was really the cause that we said something has gone very wrong in our politics. We've had polarization for a long time, but this was amplified to such an unhealthy way. And if we wouldn't step up to do something about it, who was going to do it? So we embarked on this, and as I mentioned, launched in 2017 with a series of forums, online events, virtual engagement, and we launched. We worked with the Reynolds Institute, pardon, with the Maynard Institute, with Martin and his colleagues on the issue of developing a framework called table stakes, where we said, what if we were to change the way that we serve communities of color from telling stories about communities of color to telling stories for, with, and by communities of color? Thus was born Black Tennessee Voices and Latino Tennessee Voices, initiatives that have gone from newsletters and concepts and now live shows with community storytellers coming on to tell their own stories in their own words. Our next shows are actually happening in September and October. And I mentioned that because this is part of the essay that I wrote. The essay title is A Framework for Building Trust with Communities, and it takes a multi-pronged approach to do so, and it takes multiple strategies and also an intentional means of going into communities in a way where we can have a sustainable commitment. Because obviously we want to do as much as we can, we want to do a little bit of everything, but too often times we as news organizations have gone to say, what's our next project? And 3 months later, we're on to the next thing. These things of building trust take time. And when we saw Black and Latino Tennessee Voices, we said, let's imagine if we were to make a 10-year commitment to this, what would that look like? And we're really happy that this has grown and sustained over time. And we also do some of this traditional engagement, which is still really important. Sadly, local elections only draw about our most recent local election at 20% voter turnout. But we still are committed to engaging candidates, going into talking to voters, getting information out there, and at the same time, holding in-person debates that are live broadcasts. And that's important because then the voters and citizens can tell those differences. One thing that we don't do anymore is endorsements. We don't do candidate endorsements, which I think in many ways elevated our position, because now we're not behind one person or another. We're literally talking about creating information that will benefit the community as a whole, and they'll use our platform to bring people together. This term democracy is messy. Using this quote from former Governor Bill Haslam, we were at an event that I was moderating with him a few years ago where he was protested toward the end. There was a protest from a Black Lives Matter group that demanded that he give clemency to Cyntoia Brown. If you don't remember who she is, she was in prison for life, effectively, for murdering someone when she was a child. She was a victim of sex trafficking, and there was a huge celebrity motivated move to try to get her clemency. At the time, he wasn't ready to show his cards, but afterwards he did answer the questions of the protesters. He took the time to talk about his thinking, and when he left the venue, just before he left, he told me, democracy is messy. This is something that was a little bit disheartening for some people to see this past week and a half at the Tennessee legislature, because you saw people, committee rooms getting emptied if people made noises, if they showed signs, if they became active. And the reality is that we saw that a judge ruled that a lot of those rules were unconstitutional and a violation of the First Amendment. It was a huge lesson, in-person, visceral lesson for many citizens. One of the communities that I mentioned in my essay is the main one is McMinnville, Tennessee. And McMinnville, Tennessee is about 80 miles east of Nashville, and it's very different in so many ways, in that Nashville's about 700,000 people, McMinnville's about 14,000 people, and hasn't grown much over the years, whereas Nashville has boomed. Nashville is a primarily blue community. It's a blue consolidated city-county government, whereas McMinnville voted 80% for Trump. And while they're so different, there's also a very rich history of civic leadership. And I was invited back in 2018 to address the Rotary Club of McMinnville, and had a chance to go. They hyped it up much more than probably I would have, that restoring civility in public discourse. We were so new at that time that we weren't really sure what we were doing. And one of the things that I was asked, actually the first thing I was asked when I started speaking to this group about why we were embarking on the Civility Tennessee project was, why should we trust you? And that question of why should we trust you, I keep a photo of that, those words in my office just to remind myself every single day that I have to be able to answer that question. And what you see on the right side in this slide is a TEDx talk that I gave in Nashville a few years ago in 2020, where I talked about our efforts to date. And this whole notion of how to have adult conversations, how to sit with someone, even if you have very different points of view, how do we do that and why it's so necessary to do that, even though it's incredibly hard. McMinnville is an absolutely beautiful community. I've gone back 4 times, and if you ever have a chance to go out there, there are many towns in Tennessee that resemble each other in terms of the big, the water tower, the main streets, the clocks, the county town halls, and getting to know that and being present made a huge difference for our community, because oftentimes people saw members of the media as looking down upon them, as basically being agents of disinformation, because somehow, how is it that Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton when all the polls said otherwise? And they were blaming the media, so to speak. So having an actual journalist, we know from research from the American Press Institute and the Pew Center that only about 1/5 of Americans have ever met a journalist. So why not us going to communities, to small towns and areas across the state to say, we're here and we're here to listen, and we're also here to implement that listening into actual journalism. I've mentioned already Black and Latino Tennessee Voices. Our efforts won an Online News Association award for best newsletters last year. And I also started when the pandemic began, a video podcast series on interviews, because we couldn't be around people. All my events were canceled. I decided to take the op-ed, the guest opinion column, to put a face to a byline. And what started off as 5 nice people saying, hey, we'll be willing to do that and talk about what we do, has turned into more than 360 episodes to date. And we've interviewed everyone from our senior U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn to reproductive rights activist Cherie Scott from Memphis. And it's been a way to show that, in fact, we're very much involved in these conversations of the day, and we're not favoring necessarily one party or the other. We certainly favor the facts and we favor the truth. But to be able to talk to a Republican conservative senator like Senator Blackburn about the murder of George Floyd and about protests was really fascinating, and something I certainly didn't expect. Finally, we often ask people if, are you in? Are you into this pledge? And as I mentioned, Civility Tennessee, I don't use the term civility too often. This is the name of the campaign. I like to talk about good citizenship, which I think applies to anyone who's active in society, who wants to do something that is of significance to advancing aims that would better our community, to vote in elections, to also model yourself. What is that kind of behavior? And also that it's okay to protest. It's okay to write a letter. It's very much okay to raise your voice and say to politicians, I disagree with you and I'm going to vote you out of office. That is simply part of democracy. But it's also important to become informed and to become engaged and build that community together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. Appreciate you bringing up the topic of civility and active citizenship in the conversation. Moving along here, we are a little short on time, so we're probably not going to get to Q&A. So I just want to ask of my speakers, if you wouldn't mind going into the chat, if there are any questions that you can respond to in writing, that would be great. We'll also make some contact information available if folks want to follow up with questions at the end. But I do want to leave plenty of time for our final speaker, Melissa. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. And it's such an honor to be on this panel with all these other guests. I've worked with both Jen and Martin in Colorado, and we're so lucky to have your innovation and expertise with us. So can everyone see my slides? Yeah, okay, great. My name is Melissa Davis. I'm with the Colorado Media Project. I'm a former journalist myself, but I'm also gonna really speak on behalf of the role of philanthropy in the future of local news. We have been working in this space for about the last 5 years. And in Colorado, we have kind of a unique story, and hopefully this will be inspirational to some other communities that are seeking ways, how can they help and how can they be involved? we had a kind of catalytic call to action. We actually had 5 years ago now, the editorial board of the biggest newspaper in the state, the Denver Post, really publicly called on the community for help. They said, what's happening in journalism isn't just a problem with the industry, it's a problem for all of our conversations and democracy itself. So this call to action really got a lot of people talking. It was the first time where people really started asking themselves outside of the journalism field what role we should play as civic leaders, as philanthropists, as community leaders of nonprofits and things like that. So this was really a galvanizing moment for our state. And I think others in the country are also having their own kind of wake up calls as to what happens when local news goes away. We quickly, we convened. The Media Project was formed out of the University of Denver. Their College of Computer Science and Engineering actually started the Colorado Media Project as a way to respond to what was happening in local news with first community listening. We did for the first time a statewide survey of audiences to find out what was missing in the local ecosystem. What did they need? What did they expect? What would they pay for and support over the long term? We know that losing independent local news hurts communities, and really we started thinking this isn't just the story of one news outlet. This is really how is our local information ecosystem and all the journalism that is contributed there. What happens when all of that is in threat? We are I worked for Gates Family Foundation, which is a Denver-based foundation, and we do community giving statewide. And so we were thinking not just about the Denver metro area or the footprint of the Denver Post, but really those small community newspapers, those small communities that we work in all over the state, that if they lose their solitary local source of independent local news, that could be really detrimental to our ability to continue to progress a lot of issues in the state. So, like I said, we did a lot of community listening and asking, what do people think are the solutions? These are just kind of quickly some of the things that people in some of our polling and our asking were identifying as some opportunities, more ways for communities to engage, more funding and more philanthropy. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. More collaboration among newsrooms, finding efficiencies and ways for newsrooms to not think of themselves as the only voice, as they are no longer in this digital world, but how do we get really high quality local news to more people in more ways where they are. More media literacy and more attention to diversity and inclusion. And that's really one of the most important things I'd say for the philanthropic funders that are a part of the Colorado Media Project. So I want to kind of put this out there as a model for others in community thinking about how to address these issues and how to support the innovators that, like Jen and like Martin and David, who are in perhaps your state or your geographical area. We have found that it's really useful to have a community fund, like a fund. The Colorado Media Project is based at the Rose Community Foundation. We both take money in from large donors and put money out into the field. So we're not about just, we're pooling funds to kind of address big issues by investing in strong community newsrooms that are already serving the needs of diverse communities. Creating in some cases and supporting ecosystem level supports and efficiencies so that newsrooms and journalists and communities can work together more efficiently. And then also supporting diverse civic news leaders and innovators so that we're not just supporting things that exist now, but supporting people and organizations of the future that really are going to address these needs. So as I mentioned, we kind of operate in three ways. We're a funder. We also advocate for not just local news as it is now, but as it should be, and as we hope it will be. We host visioning, which we're about to, at the end of September, bring our ecosystem together for some future visioning about what does a healthy local news and information ecosystem look like in 5 years, and how do we get there? What's the role of each one of us, and how do we contribute? So again, kind of taking it back and like making transparent the model, our North Star here is really engaging more Coloradans and shaping the future of local news. So we're doing that through commissioning research, listening to journalists and what they think the pathways are, doing audience research. We've now done 3 statewide audience surveys, and we report out that information to the field. We also have done some public policy research and looking at ways that public sources can support local news. We also are launching and supporting projects that speed local news innovation and sustainability. I don't have time to go into these, but they're all on our website at coloradomediaproject.com. And strategy 3, to the point of saying hello to Martin and Jennifer, we really intentionally, there's a lot of wonderful resources out there in the national ecosystem, and folks at the state level should really be thinking about how to tap into those. These are just a few of the partners that have been active in Colorado, and certainly we're actively out there seeking partnerships that can bring resources to local newsrooms and local communities. Since 2018, the Media Project has raised more than $6 million to build a more responsive, resilient, and inclusive local news ecosystem. These 6 funders have contributed the lion's share of that funding. And then we do grant, as I said, we do grant making. We usually put about, the vast majority of our money that we take in, we put out in direct grants to build the ecosystem with some kind of big bets of things that we think need to be present in order to support a healthy ecosystem. We support newsrooms that are directly reaching communities of color, and we partner with national partners. And then also we do really open access grant opportunities to help newsrooms acquire the skills that we believe that they need for the future. News Colorado Needs is a program that is helping newsrooms raise philanthropic support from their readers and learn how to be more mission-minded when they're talking about their value proposition. And Advancing Equity in Local News is supporting internal diversity, equity, and inclusion work, more community engagement, and leaders of color. So with that, I'm going to hand it over back to you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. You get the gold star for having to speed talk through your presentation. Thank you so much for being conscious of everyone's time. Like I mentioned, that we're short on time, so probably not going to have time for Q&A, but I did see that some of our speakers responded to questions in the chat. We'll also include any mention of resources or websites in our follow-up email, and with speaker permission to share some contact information if you'd like to follow up directly with them. But with that, I just want to give a final thank you to all of our speakers, not only, of course, for preparing for today's webinar and your time, but also for the important work that you're doing in your communities, states, and just larger for the whole field. So thank you so much. And thank you for sharing those insights. And thank you to all of us for spending an hour of your day with us. Really appreciate you. We do this webinar series every month. We focus on civic engagement, promising practices, as we call them. So you'll be included on any future announcements of webinars. We'd welcome you joining us again for a future webinar. And with that, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.